Ladies and gentlemen, Ya Ali Madat, and welcome to EPB's three-part webinar series, Reinventing Your Business for the New Normal. This evening, we will be discussing part 2, Pivoting Your Business to the New Normal. My co-panelist this evening is Mr. Rahim Mauji. Rahim is a director of Sabre Business Consultants. He's a qualified CPA in both Canada and Kenya, and has been a practicing auditor for the past 13 years. Our main focus for this evening is Ms. Nafisa Rayani. Nafisa is the founder of Honeycomb Jewelry. The idea of this webinar is to share with members of the Jamaat, no matter what business you are in, or the size, or the complexity of the business. All businesses have the ability to pivot and reinvent their business to the new normal. The structure of this webinar will be in three parts. The first part will be Nafisa's story and how she set up the business. The second part will look into how the business has performed during the pandemic, the challenges, the threats, the opportunities. And finally, we'll talk about what Nafisa's vision and goals are for her business post-COVID. So without further ado, Nafisa, please.
Thanks, Rahim. And Rahim, hi. Ya Ali Madat. So perhaps maybe I'll start by just sharing a little bit about how I got into the business. I've been in employment ever since I graduated from university, so about, without giving away my age, about 17 years or so. And I have never really attempted to be an entrepreneur in any form because I needed that safety and that stability in my income. But while I was working at the Alcan Council, the Women's Committee, the Ismaili Women's Committee, had organized a jewelry class to teach women how to make jewelry in the hopes that they would take it as a second income earner, you know, for whatever or cottage industry that they were in. And what happened is I took it because I have an interest in jewelry, and thought, you know, perhaps there would be a hobby that would be created out of it. I did not, for the life of me, you know, begin to imagine that it could turn into a business. And so I started up this this little hobby on the side, if you will. And I was making, you know, piece after piece, and every time I would walk into the office, you know, someone would comment on this piece of jewelry that I was wearing, and I would inevitably walk home, you know, without it because I had sold it or given it away during the day. And it inspired some confidence in the fact that maybe I could do this as a business. You know, I think the biggest fear for me was not having a business background, not ever having been an entrepreneur, not knowing anything about it, and jumping into something that, I mean, I'm confident about the craft, but I had no idea what the business element was. I spoke to a few people who encouraged me to do a business plan to make sure that this business would be viable before I jumped into entrepreneurship. But there was something really sort of compelling for me because I knew that this is something that I was able to do well, and I thought that I was onto something. And so what happened is, because I couldn't share focus on, you know, my full-time job as well as doing this and doing it well, I chose to give in a resignation and jump headlong into this business. And honestly, I haven't looked back since. It has been an incredible journey. It has been a short journey, I want to say. I think I'm coming up to about a year. In August, it will be a year that I have spent full focus on this business. And, you know, I've had challenges setting up the business. I had a lot of people in the industry who were advising me to take certain routes or measures in order to be successful. those ideas, I mean, I took some of them, but a lot of them didn't resonate with what I saw for my brand. And so I took what I could from those pieces of advice, but ultimately I just worked on what I believed I wanted for the brand. And it meant that I tried out some of the options that I was being asked to look at, but eventually I ended up molding the sort of the marketing for this business the way that I saw it working. I wanted to, I mean, I had a lot of people telling me that, you know, this market is saturated, and what makes me think that I'm going to be a successful jeweler in a sea of jewelers. And so what I needed to do was find a way to position myself in a distinctive way, in a way that wasn't like every other jeweler. So what I did was I looked for people in the industry who were super successful. And, you know, it was interesting that a lot of them were so willing to speak to me about it. Even though I was coming in as a potential competitor, they were open and willing to help me, guide me, to tell me what worked for them, what didn't work for them. And a lot of that informed some of, you know, the decisions that I was making in my business. I will tell you, there were a lot of times that I tanked. I would try something and it would miserably fail. And I remember my first 2 attempts to sell at fairs came out 0. I think the first one I had 0 sales, and the second one I barely made, I think 2,000 or 3,000 shillings. It was a complete disaster. But I used that, I looked at that, and I figured out that this sort of avenue for selling my kind of jewelry, which is one of a kind, bespoke, has a story behind each piece, wasn't really meant for the fairs. I wasn't going to do well, you know, sitting at a Karen flea market and trying to sell a $300 piece of jewelry. It just wasn't going to work. And so I managed to, you know, tweak certain things. I was very lucky because there were so many people around me who were willing to offer, you know, various pieces of advice and have become mentors for me in the informal way. I didn't go out and sort of engage them formally as mentors, but that's what they've ended up being. And these are friends and family who are entrepreneurs, who are business people in their own right. I will say, though, I'm a little bit stubborn and I don't always follow, you know, I don't follow things just because someone else says that I should. I really have a gut feeling about because I feel like I know my business better than anyone else. And whilst I have a lot of respect for people who are in their own kind of businesses and have been successful, that works for them. It may not necessarily work for my business. So yeah, you know, I actually ended up moving away from the selling at the fairs kind of deal to showcasing my jewelry at private events that I was holding. So I had full control. I did not enjoy the aspect of being subject to, you know, the rain, or the weather conditions, the marketing of an event organizer, and then being in a sea of like 30 or 50 vendors to sell my jewelry, which I very perhaps arrogantly think needs to be given its own you know, time and respect to be able to enjoy, to, you know, pick up a piece, really feel it, understand what the inspiration behind that was. And so I decided that I wasn't going to rely on any of those event organizers, and I was going to organize my own private showcases. So that's where I was at, and that led me until about mid-February, when I guess, you know, other things kind of happened. So that was the first bit of it. Raheem?
Oh, thank you, Nafisa. Wow, that's really a lovely story. A lot of battle scars there, I can see, as an entrepreneur. So you're becoming seasoned in the business. Raheem, any questions that you would like to pose to Nafisa on the first part?
Sure, I do. Nafisa, I'm thinking about your story from the perspective of a lot of individuals that may have a hobby and may be thinking about, well, maybe I do want to make the switch. Perhaps you could share a little bit about that turning point. What was it really that made you tip over the edge, so to speak, and say, okay, now it's time that this is no longer a hobby, and I want to invest all my time and energy into this? What would you say was it that drove you over?
Thanks, Raheem. Well, I think the feedback that I was getting was really phenomenal. So like I said, I'd walk into work wearing one of my pieces, and I would, I was working in an office full of women actually, who gave me great feedback about this, and it inspired confidence. And whilst I may not have created a formal business plan, I did sit down and I crunched some numbers. And I thought about this because I needed, I have responsibilities just like everyone else. And I needed to have the confidence to know that if I was to do this full time, that it was also going to pay the bills, because I don't have the luxury of, a lot of family money or that sort of thing. And so I needed to also be very careful about that decision. And so I remember I was sitting at a Java with a friend, pulled out a napkin, and a pen, and just started to scribble down numbers and say, okay, so based on the fact that I don't have any employees, I'm a one-man show, how much do I need to sell at what price to be able to, sustain myself? So not just cover costs, but to make enough money to continue to have the lifestyle that I want. And if I don't think that I'm going to start off at that, how long do I think it's going to take? And so it was more than just one napkin, but that is what I did. And it started to look very doable. And there's a lot of noise, a lot of chatter, a lot of fear, and I hate to say this, but I think everyone experiences it. A lot of people in my realm who were saying, don't do it. Honestly, it's a bit of a risk, it's a gamble. And I was very confident about my craft. And once I was able to cover my bases when it came to how I was going to procure the materials, how I was going to market the product, and what I was going to do to set myself out, like apart from the rest of the competition, it really gave me the confidence to say, you know what, I can do this. I did make sure that I had contingency funds, because I knew that it was going to be a while before it got to a place where it was going to sustain me. And I will tell you as well that I was pleasantly surprised. I thought it was going to take a lot longer than it actually did to get to that level. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it does, definitely. I have one more question, actually.
Sure.
So every business that starts up has challenges in the beginning. And you talked about having a lot of chatter as being one of the challenges that you faced. Could you maybe talk about some of your top 2 or 3 biggest challenges or fears that you faced in the beginning, and what kept you inspired to persevere through all of it and keep going?
Sure. So I have to say, I think the fact that I have such a passion for what I do was a really big driving force. So I kind of didn't want to listen to any of the negative stuff. I mean, the negative stuff would come my way. I wouldn't succeed at something, and I would stop, take a step back, look at it and say, okay, so I refuse to believe that this will not work. I think it just won't work in this way, and I need to just change it. So, I think I've been relatively adaptable, because there's a lot of things that have come my way that just haven't worked. For example, selling at the fairs, it didn't do well for me. And yet I could see all my fellow jewelers thriving in that environment. I could have just thrown in the towel at that point and said, oh, well, this really isn't going to work. So I think, understanding my market has been a huge thing. I think the challenge initially was that because I was going into it a little bit blind, I didn't really understand who my market was. I think that's actually been an evolution of sorts. I thought I was going to target a certain demographic of the market, and that has evolved a little bit as my art has also evolved, I think. I think the second challenge also is procurement, because I think that, you know, we are so blessed to have access to a lot of things locally for, you know, raw materials for what I do. But there are certain raw materials that I need that are just based on quality that you can rely on, that I've had to find a way to bring in. And so understanding the tax implications or the customs, you know, that I would have to pay, the fees that I would have to pay bringing stuff in, because I wanted to make sure that I did everything in a legitimate way. I think for every challenge, I sort of have like a solution that's been presented to me. I've always been able to, I've reached out to EPB multiple times to get, you know, guidance and advice. They've directed me to people who've been able to assist me with those things. I think there is a lot of things around the compliance and tax issues that I've actually spoken with you, because I was directed to you for that guidance and advice. And it's something that, you know, again, it's fear because I didn't understand it. Once I understood it, it was clear as day. And it's actually it's been very simple for me to get into this and be compliant, and then be able to sleep at night knowing that I've got everything above the table. You know, I don't have to worry about it. But it was a challenge in terms of maybe the understanding of it. But again, I was able to reach out and get clarity on that. So that was big for me. The other challenge I would say is being a one-person show for me has had its challenges, because I could make jewelry until the cows come home, but if I can't find a way to market effectively, I'm not going to sell it. And so I had to hone my marketing skills. I'm still working on that, and I'm still, you know, I spend a fair bit of time understanding how that bit of the process works, because I need to be able to reach my market effectively for the business to work. And so you know, I could engage other people to do it, and it, you know, might cost a small fee, but I have been doing all of that myself. So I think the challenge is balancing that time and understanding, you know, how much time to focus on what, because I tend to just want to sit and, you know, make jewelry into the wee hours of the night, but I really have to focus on the business aspect of things. So that for me has been a challenge as well.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have, Rain.
Yeah, no, fantastic questions, Raheem. Thank you very much for that. And if it's again, very honest, very open answers. You know, we've all been there as entrepreneurs. You know, you've seen fear, and it's a matter of just going through that fear with honesty, integrity, and being agile. And I think that's
Right.
one of the great takeaways that I think that you're bringing to the fore, which is really important, that members of the Jamaat who want to build their own business, that's what they need. If we can go now to the second part of this webinar, Nafisa, now that, you know, the pandemic all of a sudden arrived at our doorstep, lots of changes. Changes in market, changes in distribution, changes in marketing. Please share with us, you know, some of the challenges and how you got around them.
Sure. Well, so I'm going to say I was on a real high. I ended last year in a phenomenal way for my business. And January and February weren't too bad. I had an event in February that was very successful. And then COVID hit, and I don't know how else to say this other than to tell you I went into panic and a little bit of depression for about a good, you know, 4 to 6 weeks. It just looked hopeless. I felt completely dejected. I kept thinking about the fact that I was in an industry or a business that wasn't essential. And people were dying around the world. And I'm thinking, who in their right minds is going to spend money on jewelry at this time? And so what happened is, sure enough, my sales completely tanked during that time. I had 0 sales coming in, 0 income. And I started to think about what I was going to do to, like, do I need to go back into employment? Who's going to be hiring at this time? It was a very panicky time for me, which I think, I'd like to think is natural. I think a lot of people felt that way. But at some point I realized, just by switching my focus a little bit, I'm a big believer in you know, kind of what you focus on expands, right? And I started to realize that I was looking for the doom and gloom, and I was finding it because it was there for me to find. And I decided that I didn't want that to be my narrative anymore. I started to look online for people who were thriving in spite of this pandemic. And I started to research a little bit online and find out that, you know what? People are making money right now, in spite of whatever's going on. People are shopping for non-essential items as well as essential items. I realized that if there's ever a time that people have been online the most, this is it. And they're online, they're probably saving money on other things that they would ordinarily have been, you know, spending their money on entertainment, on eating out, and they had this money and they were shopping online. And I started to listen to a few, you know, business coaches online. I again just kind of tuned into the people who seemed to be thriving in this situation and tried to figure out what they were doing differently and what I needed to do to also implement that. And then I had a pretty big aha moment when I realized activity begets activity. I wasn't putting in any energy into marketing my product because I thought I was worried about it coming across as being tone deaf. People were struggling, they were not in the right mind frame, and I didn't want to be product pushing at a time like this. But I think that was an initial period, and I think we had come past it in about 4 weeks or so. You know, I mean, Kenyans were talking about how traffic had increased on the roads and retail outlets were opening up. And I said, there's no way I'm going to sit back and not take advantage of this. But activity begets activity. I stopped being active on, you know, in terms of the marketing, in terms of the products. I wasn't putting my stuff out there. And so, of course, I wasn't selling. So I began immediately by just kind of testing things out. I started to post, you know, on my social media pages, a few of my pieces, and I immediately started to get responses. And sales started to pick up. And I realized that I needed to find a way, because I mean, so I want to say also, whilst it may be non-essential stuff that I'm making, it's also very meaningful. It's not a run-of-the-mill piece of jewelry. I tell a story that inspired each of the pieces, and it generally resonates with people. It's a meaningful purchase for them. It's not just a, oh, well, I bought a necklace to match, you know, whatever outfit I'm wearing. And so I think that, you know, at a time like this as well, people resonate with that kind of authentic connection with each other. And that's, I mean, it's the truth of the matter is we're all experiencing this. We've all been affected in some way or the other. Everyone is experiencing some form of loss. And I would incorporate that into, you know, speaking about my pieces and the inspiration behind the pieces, and it was working. So that's the first thing I did was, you know, revive the activity, if you will. And the second thing I did was try and figure out, my major source of income was coming through from people, you know, gathering for my private showcases, and I wasn't able to do that anymore. So I needed to figure out a way to combat that and use the virtual world to still showcase my pieces. Perhaps not in a group, because still can't quite conceptualize how a group of women are going to come together on a Zoom call, you know, 20, 30 women, for me to showcase my jewelry. I don't know how that's going to work. But there are some things that I can do differently. And I'm using a lot of digital media. I'm using, you know, things that I don't really have to put in a whole bunch of investment into. And yet I'm able to, take simple videos, show a 3D sort of image of what this piece is going to look like and how it moves and how the light catches it, and take a video of myself explaining what the inspiration behind this is, because maybe that's my way to do it, and so because I'm not able to sit across from someone at a private showcase and explain it to them. And so I started to do those things. I think one of the biggest things I have now embarked on, and hopefully will come to fruition in about a week or 10 days, is setting up an online platform, an e-commerce platform. Now that's always been something that I've wanted to do. It was a long time coming. This situation has just pushed me to it a lot quicker. Now is the time to get online. If I didn't have an online presence, I would have died a very quick death. While social media is great, not everyone is on social media, and it doesn't provide the platform to actually conduct e-commerce effectively. So I'm sure this is going to be the next segment of your webinar, but it was through DTB and DPO, which I think is going to be spoken about in the next segment. But it's provided me this opportunity to get into something again without having to make a heavy investment of any sort, to have an online platform to sell my pieces. Like I said, at a time where we are probably seeing unprecedented numbers of people online and shopping online. So those are the things that I've had to do, and I think that this situation has hit us perhaps a little more starkly and a little bit more harshly than anything else would. But it's really no different from other challenges that you face when you're going through a business. Things happen, stuff happens, and if you're not able to mold very quickly or adapt very quickly, that means, that's it. I think there's possibly, if I saw that there was no recovery from this and I needed to cut my losses and move on to something else, I think having the wisdom to do that is also important. But I saw potential in this, and I did a fair amount of research to look for, the positive stuff for where it was working. Because like I said, if you want to look for the doom and gloom, it's there to find. And I didn't want to give up on something that was working so fabulously for me. So that is what I've done in the current situation to change things up, to ensure that, I'll tell you also, I haven't been drumming up as much business as I was pre-COVID, but I'm keeping my head above water. And I think that is probably best case scenario right now. And I'm grateful for that, because if I can keep above water and have my brand still top of mind, when we come out of this, if we come out of this, I don't have to start from scratch to build Honeycomb Jewelry as a brand, because I have stayed top of mind, in people's minds. And when they're ready to come and shop full swing, I'll be there. Over to you.
Thank you again, Nafisa. Wise words. But I think the one thing that I'd wanted to, mention before I pass it on to Raheem is it about attention. Your attention is, there's an old yogic saying, it's you've got a garden. You either put your attention on the weeds or on the roses. And where you put your attention is where it grows. So you've decided to put your attention on roses. And so your garden is blossoming. And I also wanted to mention, like in our first webinar, Al-Karim Jiwa of DTB was also saying something, the new normal, what it's going to look like. And he's talking about virtual showrooms. And that's already beginning to come along. And you mentioned that as well. And of course, in our final webinar, DPO and DTB are there to help small businesses and medium-sized businesses to take care, to use e-commerce as a platform for growing their businesses. Raheem, anything that you'd like to add in at this point?
So yeah, thanks, Nafisa and Raheem. I do have one or two questions actually. Nafisa, I've been thinking about your journey and your business. You have a product that you sell, and prior to COVID, a lot of your sales came from face-to-face interactions or people being able to look and touch and feel your jewelry, putting it on. You know, how that felt had a very big impact on whether you were able to make a sale before. But when I think about other members of the Jamaat that may be listening, a lot of them may be making food products, or they may be making other products that they may be asking themselves, how do I get online? I'm not familiar with social media. Can you share some of your journey or some tips that you may have to people that may want to get online, that may want to get onto social media, but may not exactly know how to do so?
Sure. So I will say that whilst I have chosen to do most of my social media marketing and videography and photography and everything is me, there are people, and I would say a lot of the young people right now, because let's face it, right? Some of the teenagers out there are way more tech savvy than any of us, right? And they know a lot more about how well this works. And so if it's a matter of being open to and able to learn about how to get onto social media and use it, then that's great. There's so many options available online for you to learn. But if it's something that you just can't do, and if it's just something that doesn't feel comfortable for you and it would be ineffective use of your time, like I said, there are people, a grandchild, a niece or nephew, and if you have a little bit of money to spare, spend, I think even for as little as 5,000 shillings a month, you could find someone to do some basic social media marketing for you. Take some photographs, enhance them a little bit digitally and post them. It doesn't take very much. And maybe there's some kids out there willing to make a couple of bucks on the side. And so that's always an option. It's not something that I have had to use, but it is definitely an option that I would say is out there. And I think, again, it's this fear of the unknown. It's this idea of, well, I don't know how it works, and so I'm scared of it. And I think because I experienced that with my mother, who is in her 70s and doesn't know how to adapt to certain things. But I think that there are options, and if there is some level of adaptability and the willingness to learn, there are options out there. But there's always someone who can help with something as basic as managing social media posts, for example. And it's basic stuff, and if you need to pay someone, it doesn't have to be very much. There are always options, I think.
Thank you. I just have one more question for you.
Sure.
Raheem Darani gave us a very a fabulous quote, so I'd like to also throw in a quote of my own. So Wayne Dyer says, when you squeeze an orange, you get orange juice. So when you are squeezed, what comes out? And I always find that every time you put yourself or a business through a period of crisis, it's a very defining moment for you. And it's in these moments of crisis that you get your most learnings out of everything. So could you share maybe the top 2 or 3 most pivotal learnings that you've had in the last, during this COVID crisis?
Wow, Raheem. Okay. You're absolutely right. I love that quote, by the way, by Wayne Dyer, because I feel like I'm more excited about what I'm seeing right now for my business because of how drastic the changes have to be than I was before. And I don't know, that may not make any sense to anyone, but it's actually exciting because I can see this whole realm opening up now in terms of virtual reality and all kinds of things that I could do for this business that I couldn't see before. So I'm sorry, back to your actual question to me was about the challenges that I faced.
No, it was, what have you learned the most? The top 2 or 3 things that you've learned the most during this crisis?
Yes. So I think the top thing that I've learned is that this is going to sound a little bit arrogant perhaps, but I am stronger than I thought I was, and I'm more resilient than I thought I was. I think that when I was going through that patch of about, the month or 6 weeks where I thought it was all over, and I was going to crash and burn so soon after leaving stable employment, I wasn't entirely sure I was going to bounce back from that. But I'm stronger than I gave myself credit for. So I think that's been my biggest learning. And I feel like if I'm able to get through this and able to adapt to this, because whilst we're talking about what the new norm is going to look like, I think we're kind of experiencing it right now. This is some form of what the new norm looks like. And if I'm able to ride this storm, then I think that it gives me the confidence to take other challenges that might come my way later on. So that's the first learning. The second learning is, whilst I haven't been great about listening to advice from other people, my ego has had to take a bit of a check because I have realized that I am not always the smartest person. And I'm so grateful that I have so many people around me. I mean, I do seek them out. And I think that it's been a really important thing for me to choose who to speak to and who to surround myself with, because that has shifted the energy for me as well. Like I said, if you want to look for the doom and gloom, it's there. And so that has been a big thing, to understand that people do have a lot of valuable advice to give. I just think that, what I've done is I have also had to step back sometimes and say, is that relevant to me in my business? And, or do I need to tweak that piece of information and make it, personalize it, customize it for me so that I can work? But it's incredible the number of people who are willing to help if you just ask. And that's the first step, is just asking. And I do find that a lot of the times what's worked for me and has worked really well is not to try and be parasitic in the way that you ask for help, but it's to say, hey, listen, this is something that I could do for you because these are my strengths, right? So perhaps I will say to you, if you need some help with writing out a really strong marketing pitch, I think I have some strength in that. In return, do you think you could possibly, guide me on tax compliance or that sort of thing? And I think people are more receptive to that sort of thing. But I do think people are inherently good and inherently willing to help. And you just have to be brave enough, because I think it takes a certain amount of courage to put yourself out there and ask for help. So that's been, I think, another learning for me, is that people are inherently good and are willing to help. And you don't always have to spend a lot of money for that kind of valuable advice.
Great, thank you, Nafisa. Over to you, Rahim.
Thank you, Nafisa. Again, 2 things I need to tell you: cash flow management and compliance. Again, that was the topic of our first webinar. So if you haven't watched it, please take some time and watch it. Rahim Maudry gave an excellent presentation. So on to the final bit of our webinar for this evening. Challenges, threats, what's going to happen once everything opens up again? Are you excited? Are you a little scared? I hope a little bit of both, but more excited and less scared. So what are your thoughts?
So I think a little bit of fear is always a good thing, as long as you can channel it. And so, what I'm doing is I'm really just using that apprehension and that fear, because I mean, that's just the honest truth is that it is scary right now. It's a scary time because there's so much uncertainty. And so what I'm doing is, like I said before, I think that what we're seeing right now is a semblance of what our new norm is going to be. I think that there are a few things that I am looking at doing that right now that I think will carry me through going forward as well. The having a strong online presence. I mean, if there was ever a time that I'm grateful that I didn't jump onto the bandwagon that everyone else was telling me to do, to have a brick and mortar shop, I mean, I'm really grateful that I kind of stuck to my guns and decided not to do that. So I don't have to worry about a brick and mortar shop. But I do host private events, and that has taken a big hit because I'm not able to do that right now. So I've been thinking about, you know, the potential of still having very personalized shopping experiences for 1 or 2 people at a time, for example, who can still come in, touch and feel the product, and still have an experience. You know, still have a little bit of an appetizer and a cocktail, and you know, just enjoy the space as I would for a group of 30 or 40 women, and just scale it down so that, you know, there's a way to manage this whole being safe and socially distant and that sort of thing. I don't know what the new norm is going to look like. None of us do. So I don't know exactly what I'm going to have to do when things really open up. But I think that is one thing. The fact that I'm going online for a full e-commerce platform, I think that's going to be super helpful. I am looking at options for using augmented reality, just to see how that might work, and that might be, you know, in a later phase of the journey. But I think, you know, virtually trying on jewelry is an exciting thing. A lot of people are doing it, and I think it's a bit of a heavy investment, and so that might come a little bit later on, but that's definitely an option. And I think the key is for me to really be in touch with my market and the needs of the market. I think the second that I stop or I become a little bit disconnected from that, I'm going to lose out. So I think I spoke about the concern that I had about being a little bit tone deaf, you know, product pushing when people were not in the mind frame to accept or to think about shopping for non-essential items. And I think it's important to always have a pulse on what the market is feeling. And if the market is saying, hey man, we're tired of sitting at home and we want to get out, we want to do it in a safe way, then I will have those options ready for, like I said, smaller private showcases or you know, individual interaction. The other thing that I'm doing currently, and it will also possibly you know, continue on in the future, is virtual consultations. A lot of my clients want custom made jewelry, which is what I do. And so instead of having a you know, face-to-face conversation, what's happening is we're jumping on a video call on WhatsApp, on Zoom, or whatever it is. And, you know, they can, it feels like it feels just as good as a personal, you know, face-to-face interaction. They can show me the outfits that they want to wear the jewelry with. They can explain to me what it is they want, and, you know, consultations can happen that way. And so that's happening right now. I can see that kind of still happening in the future. I think that I just have to continue to make sure that I am open to adaptability, because I don't know what is going to hit us next and how it's going to look. And so that's just my focus right now. It's just to stay fluid.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying. Being adaptable and being agile. I think those are the two key skills that every business needs to going forward. Raheem, anything to add at this point in time?
Thanks, Raheem. So, Nafisa, I only have one question for you this time. You know, when a lot of people call me, I sense a lot of fear. People are really scared about what's happening. They're scared about what may happen in the future. They don't really know what to do. And for someone like yourself that has gone through that phase of panic and fear and now has come out of it, what do you think you could share with them now to help them?
Right. Well, I think I want to just sort of lead first by saying that if there is anyone that should be, worried about the future, someone like myself I have responsibilities. I have, I don't have a whole bunch of assets. I still pay rent. The idea of not having a stable income is scary, and I'm responsible, obviously, for one other person in my life, and her care is extremely important to me. So not coming from a place where I have contingency funds, but I don't have a whole lot, and so the fear is very real. But here's the thing: is I can't, every time I start to feel fearful about the future and how it could potentially be very bleak, the truth of the matter is I don't know what tomorrow holds. None of us do. And I can't I have to find a way to just focus on what I do have control over. And what I do have control over is what's happening right now. And so this is where my focus is right now. I know what I can do to make sure that I can, ride out the storm for today, tomorrow, and the week after, possibly. Even that, none of us know what's going to happen in the next moment. But all I'm saying is I think that fear, whilst it feels really very real, it's a little bit unfounded, because we don't know. There's nothing real about what we think we know about the future. And so for me, the only way for me to cope with this, because if I start thinking of the what ifs, I promise you, I probably will not get out of bed tomorrow. It's such an all-consuming fear to worry about how you're going to feed your family, worry about whether you're going to have a roof over your head, worry about whether your loved ones or yourself are going to fall ill from this thing and have to be hospitalized. But I think that those are a lot of what ifs, and they can, I know for me, it can be extremely damaging. And so what I've done is, to the best of my ability, I'm not always a champion at it, but I do try, to the best of my ability, is to focus on what's happening right now and to control what I can in the now. And just take every day as it comes. I do have goals and I do have aspirations for the future, but like I said before, that fluidity and that adaptability also has to come into play. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you for sharing also. Raheem?
Thank you for sharing, Nafisa. I think we've kind of come to the end of this webinar. I just wanted to thank you, Nafisa, for being so open and honest and giving some really good nuggets of advice to people who want to start a business or people who are currently in business and maybe struggling just that little bit. Raheem, thank you again for being my co-panelist on this webinar. Your questions have been excellent. Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Raheem.
All right, so I guess I will see you guys on the third webinar. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks.